I left everything behind. 5 years building a life in the United States, a job, an apartment, independence, everything I had always wanted to become. I left it all in 48 hours. Because my father was sick. Because family comes first. Because I was raised believing that love is proven through sacrifice. But when I got home, I discovered the illness was smaller than they had told me. The debts were larger than I ever imagined. And my future had already been promised to someone else. Without asking me. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, my job was filled, my visa expired, and the apartment I had called home was emptied without me. In less than 2 months, I lost everything it had taken me 5 years to build. And the worst part? It was my own father who held the door open while I fell. My name is Anika Sharma. I am 29 years old. And this is the story of how my love for my family cost me absolutely everything, and what I chose to do afterward. I remember exactly where I was when my phone rang. It was a Tuesday evening in Chicago, and the winter that year had been especially brutal. Snow covered the sidewalks like a thick layer of silence, and I was in my apartment, small, but mine, completely mine, warming my hands around a cup of chai I had learned to make on my own. Because no American version of masala tea ever came close to what my mother used to prepare when I was a child. I grew up in Pune, in a middle-class family where the family name was worth more than money in the bank, and believe me, money in the bank was something that rarely lasted. My father, Ramesh Sharma, was a man of strong presence, an even stronger voice, and an impressive ability to make any room believe he had everything under control. He was an engineer, or at least he had been. When things began to shift at the company where he worked, he never openly admitted it. He just grew quieter. And when a man like my father goes quiet, you learn early that his silence weighs more than anyone else's words. My mother, Sunita, was the opposite. Gentle, understated. Always present in the corners of the house, in the kitchen, in the sewing room, on the balcony watering her plants. She loved my father in a way I could never fully understand. A love that seemed, all at once, like devotion and resignation. And I was the eldest daughter. Which, in our culture, means many things at the same time. It means pride when you do well. It means responsibility when things go wrong. It means you carry the weight of the family on your back even when you are still learning to walk on your own. When I was accepted into a technology program in the United States at 24, my father cried. I had never seen him cry before. He hugged me at the Pune airport and whispered in my ear, "You will be different from all of us, Anika. You will go far." I carried that sentence inside me like a flame. Chicago was not easy at first. Homesickness is a strange thing, it doesn't show up in the obvious moments, like on Diwali or your mother's birthday. It shows up when you're at the grocery store and can't find fresh coriander. When you try to explain to an American colleague what a thali is and give up halfway through. When you call home and the connection drops 3 times and you finally give up and lie on your bed staring at the ceiling with a hollow feeling in your chest that has no name in English. But I stayed. I learned. I grew. I landed my first job as a data analyst at a tech company in my 2nd year. It wasn't a dream job, but it was mine. It paid well enough that I could send money home every month, something I started doing almost immediately. Because there was an old debt my father never explained clearly, and my mother asked with her eyes even when her mouth said everything was fine. $300 a month at first. Then $500. When I was promoted, it crossed 1,000. I never asked where the money was going. I trusted. My father called every Sunday. He asked about work, about the city, about my colleagues. Sometimes he asked about the Indian boys I was meeting there, a subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, way of asking whether I was seeing someone outside the community. I deflected with humor. He laughed, but I knew he was keeping note. In the last 2 years before the call, our conversations had grown shorter. My father seemed tired in a different way, not the physical tiredness of someone who had worked all day, but something deeper. As if he were carrying something he could no longer fully hide, but didn't know how to show. I noticed. And I didn't ask. That is a regret I still carry. The call came on a Tuesday, as I said. It was my uncle Vikram, my father's younger brother, the only one in the family who had always spoken to me without beating around the bush. When I saw his name on the screen, my stomach dropped before I even answered. Anika. His voice was low. Your father is not well. It's his heart. He's at home, but the doctor said he needs complete rest, and your mother is alone trying to manage everything. I sat down on the edge of the bed. How long? I asked, and even I wasn't sure exactly what I was asking. How long did he have? How long did I need? How much time still existed between me and that life I had left behind? He asked for you, Anika. A pause. He didn't say it directly, you know how he is. But he asked. And that was it. Nothing more was needed. That night I didn't sleep. I sat by the window watching the snow fall on the empty street, trying to do the math, not of money, but of everything. Of the time I had spent away. Of the conversations I had postponed. Of the times I had said, "I'll call earlier next week," and didn't. Of the questions I hadn't asked when I should have. My father was 61 years old. His heart had spoken before he could. In the morning, I called my manager and asked for unpaid leave. He said he understood, wished me strength, said that when I returned we would talk through the details. I thanked him on autopilot, my mind already somewhere else. I bought the ticket that same afternoon. Departure in 3 days. I didn't know exactly how long I would stay. 2 weeks, I thought. Maybe a month. Long enough to see my father improve, help my mother reorganize herself, and then return to Chicago before my life there began to unravel at the edges. I didn't know I would not be coming back so soon. The Pune airport has a specific smell that no other place in the world has. It is a mix of jasmine flowers that women wear in their hair, of fried food from some stall in the back, of recent rain on warm asphalt. When you spend years away and that smell hits you in the face as the automatic doors slide open, it's as if time leaps and suddenly you're 17 again, still unaware of the weight of choices. My mother was waiting for me alone. She looked smaller than I remembered. Or perhaps I had grown in ways that distance concealed. She hugged me in the middle of the arrivals hall, not caring about the luggage, not caring about the people passing by. And in that embrace I felt a mixture of things I couldn't yet identify, relief, longing, and something darker that I didn't want to name in that moment. "Is he okay?" I asked against her shoulder. She took a second before answering. "He is at home," she said. "He is waiting for you." Only much later, replaying that conversation in my memory, did I realize what she had not said. She didn't say he was okay. She said he was waiting for me. And those two things, I would learn in the days that followed, were very different. The house of my childhood was on a narrow street in the Kothred neighborhood of Pune. It was an ordinary house, 2 floors, sand-colored walls, an iron grill on the living room window that my mother always decorated with a pot of holy basil. When I was a child, that house seemed enormous to me. Full of smells, sounds, life. My father's radio playing early in the morning. The sound of pots and pans at 6 a.m., when my mother was already awake preparing breakfast. The neighbors who showed up without warning and stayed for hours, drinking chai and talking about things I pretended not to be listening to from the top of the stairs. When the taxi stopped in front of that iron grill, I stayed in the car for a moment without getting out. It wasn't nostalgia. It was something else, a hesitation I couldn't explain at the time, as if some part of me already knew that once I crossed that door, something would change in a way that couldn't be undone. My mother had already stepped out with the smaller suitcase. I paid the driver, took a deep breath, and went inside. My father was sitting in the armchair in the living room. The same armchair as always, dark fabric, wooden armrests worn at the edges. Slightly tilted to the left side because he always sat more toward that side. I had grown up watching him in that armchair, with the newspaper open on his lap or his glasses at the tip of his nose, looking at the television with the expression of someone who analyzes everything in silence. He looked tired. But he did not look sick. Not in the way I had imagined during the nearly 20-hour flight, not pale, not weak. Not with that air of urgency that my Uncle Vikram's voice had planted in me. He was there, solid, present, glasses on his face and a half-finished cup of chai on the side table next to him. He had been expected to be much worse, but my heart told me something still wasn't right. When he saw me, something passed across his face. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't pure joy. It was something in between, a relief mixed with a tension that he immediately tried to conceal behind a smile. "Anika." He said my name the way only he said it, with that gentle authority, as if my name were a declaration. I knelt to touch his feet, as I always had. He rested his hand on my head for a moment, in blessing. And for those few seconds, everything felt exactly as it had always been. But when I stood up and looked into his eyes, I saw it. My father could never fool me completely. He was good at fooling the world. He knew how to project confidence, how to speak with conviction about subjects he barely understood, how to walk into a room and make everyone believe he was in control. But with me, since I was small, there had always been that millimeter of hesitation in his eyes that gave him away when something was wrong. That afternoon, that millimeter was there. I chose not to ask. Not yet. The first 2 days were almost normal. My mother cooked everything I had missed: dal fry, bindi masala, fresh chapati, rice made the way only she makes it, with a pinch of something I was never able to replicate on my own in Chicago. I ate with that mixture of comfort and melancholy that expats know well, the pleasure of return and the awareness that this pleasure has an expiration date. My father sat in the living room, quieter than usual. He received visits from some relatives, uncles, cousins, old neighbors who came to see how he was doing. I served chai, smiled, answered questions about the United States with short, polite answers. "Is it cold there?" "Very." "Are Americans friendly?" "They're different." "Do you earn well?" Enough. Nobody asked how long I would be staying. Which was strange. Because in an Indian family, that is usually the first question. On the evening of the second day, my mother came into my room while I was unpacking the suitcase I had left half done. She closed the door carefully, which immediately told me that what was coming was not casual conversation. She sat on the edge of the bed and stared at her hands for a moment. "Anika," she began, "I need you to know some things. Before other people tell you in the wrong way." And so it began. The debts had existed for more than 3 years. My father had invested money in a business with an old partner, someone he trusted, someone from our community, someone my mother had tried to warn him against and whose warnings my father had dismissed with the characteristic conviction of a man who cannot admit he might be wrong. The business had collapsed. The partner had disappeared with part of the capital. And my father, instead of telling the family, had taken out loans to try to cover the loss. Bank loans. Loans from acquaintances. Loans that had grown with interest he couldn't pay. The money I had been sending every month, the $300, then the $500, then the over $1,000, had gone, in large part, to pay the interest on these debts. Not toward household expenses as I had imagined. Not toward my parents' retirement. Toward debts I didn't even know existed. I heard all of this sitting on the floor of my childhood bedroom, back against the bed and knees pulled to my chest, and I felt something that wasn't exactly anger, it was something colder. Like when you step on a stair that isn't there and your stomach drops before you understand what happened. "How much?" I asked. My voice came out steadier than I expected. My mother said a number. I closed my eyes. "Ma," I said slowly, "that is more than I earn in a year." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. I didn't confront my father that night. I needed time to organize what I was feeling, because there was too much happening at once, and I knew that if I went to speak with him before I was ready, I would say things I would regret. I went to bed late. Or rather, I went to lie down late, because sleep didn't come. I stared at the ceiling of my childhood bedroom, the same ceiling I had stared at for 18 years before leaving, with that small stain near the window that looked like a map of a country that doesn't exist, and tried to understand how I had arrived here. I had trusted. That was the simplest and most devastating problem at the same time. I had trusted blindly, because he was my father, because family doesn't lie to family. Because I was raised to believe that a father's love is unconditional and that a child's sacrifice is repaid with honesty. But while I was building my life in a country of winter and snow, sending money home every month with the clear conscience of someone who thinks they're doing the right thing, my father was drowning in debt and had not said a word to me. And I had left everything to come. On the third day, my Uncle Vikram arrived early. He didn't come alone, he brought my Uncle Mohan, my father's older brother, a man of few words and very firm opinions. The two of them sat in the living room with my father, and my mother came to get me from my room with a look that told me I needed to be present. It was the first family meeting where I understood, with clarity, that the subject was me. They spoke for about 20 minutes about the debts, about the family situation, about the burden my father had been carrying alone. They used words like responsibility and honor and what is the right thing to do. My father stayed quiet for most of it, looking at his hands. My mother moved between the kitchen and the living room, appearing and disappearing as if she didn't know where she was supposed to be. And then my Uncle Mohan turned to me. "Anika," he said, with that measured voice of someone who believes the weight of his tone substitutes for the quality of his argument, "there is a boy. Son of the Desi family, from Nashik. Good family, established business. Your father and his father have already spoken a few times." I looked at my father. He didn't look at me. "Spoken about what, exactly?" My voice came out low. "About an arrangement," said my Uncle Vikram. And at least he had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable. "Nothing formal yet. But the Desai family is willing to help with part of the debts, if the marriage happens." The silence that followed was the longest of my life. I looked at my father once more. And this time, he looked at me. And in his eyes there was so much shame and desperation. And that complicated love that fathers like him never know how to express any other way except by demanding, that for a moment I almost gave in. Almost said it's fine. Almost became the obedient daughter the entire room expected me to be. But it was not fine. And I knew that with every part of me. "I understand," I said, standing up. "We need to talk. But not today." And I left the room before any of them could respond. I went for a walk. I hadn't planned where to go, I simply grabbed my dupatta, came down the stairs before anyone could call me back, and stepped out the front door without looking sideways. The streets of Kothred received me with their familiar noise, horns, street vendors, the smell of incense coming from the small temple on the corner, uniformed children coming back from school with backpacks bigger than themselves. I walked for almost an hour without any destination. It was the first time in 3 days I was truly alone, without the heavy presence of the house, without my mother's looks full of unspoken apologies, without my father's loaded silence. And in that solitude of my hometown streets, I began to feel the real dimension of what was happening. It wasn't just the debts. It wasn't just the arranged marriage without consulting me. It was the accumulation of everything, years of decisions made around me, about me, with my money, with my future, without anyone once finding it necessary to ask what I wanted. I had been summoned back not because my father needed me, but because my father needed a solution. And I, the daughter who had gone far, who earned in dollars, who had made it, I was the most convenient solution he had. I sat on a stone bench near the temple and let that thought land completely. It hurt in a way I hadn't expected. That evening, after my uncles had left and the house returned to silence, I knocked on my parents' bedroom door. My mother opened it, looked at me, and quietly went to the kitchen. That was the greatest act of love she could have given me in that moment, leaving me alone with him. My father was sitting on the edge of the bed, already in his pajamas, suddenly looking much older than when I had arrived. As if the meeting that day had stripped away a layer of protection he used to appear whole. I closed the door and sat in the chair across from him. We stayed in silence for a moment. In any other context, that silence would have been comfortable, the silence of a father and daughter who know each other well enough not to need to fill every space with words. But that silence was different. It was the silence of two people who need to talk about something both of them would rather not have to talk about. I was the one who started. "Why didn't you tell me?" He didn't pretend not to understand. That, at least, spared me from having to be more direct. "Because you were doing well," he said, his voice low. "You were building your life. I didn't want to." He stopped. Started again. "A father shouldn't need to ask his daughter for help." "But you did ask," I said. "Just not in the right way. You didn't ask for help, you called me back without telling me what was really happening, and now I'm here discovering that my money was used to pay debts you hid, and that you made arrangements about my future with people I don't even know." He kept staring at the floor. "The Desi family are good people, Anika. That's not the point, Papaji. The boy that is not the point." My voice came out firmer than I had planned, but I didn't back down. "The point is that you made a decision about my life without asking me. As if I were still 16. As if everything I built meant nothing." He raised his eyes then. And I saw in them something I had not expected to see, not anger, not the usual authority he used when he felt challenged. I saw a man who was afraid. A man who had made a series of wrong decisions and was drowning in their consequences, and who had called his daughter back because he no longer knew what to do, but also didn't know how to admit that without losing that part of himself that depended on appearing strong. And for a moment, I loved him and was destroyed by him at the same time. "I needed a way out, Anika," he said. And his voice was different now, smaller, more honest. "I was wrong. I know I was wrong. But the debt is real, the pressure is real, and I didn't see another way." "You could have called me," I said, and my voice finally broke a little at the edges. "You could have called me and told me the truth, and I would have helped. Not because you forced me to come back, but because I would have chosen to help. There is an enormous difference between those two things." He didn't respond. I left the room without waiting for him to. In the days that followed, the pressure began coming from other directions. My Aunt Priya, Uncle Mohan's wife, a woman who had turned other people's opinions into a vocation, appeared at the house one afternoon under the pretense of bringing sweets and stayed for 3 hours. Somewhere between the second cup of chai and the third time she mentioned the Desai family, she turned to me with that specific smile that certain older women have mastered, the smile that looks like kindness but functions like pressure. "Anika, you spent years abroad. That is admirable, nobody is saying otherwise. But a woman your age, without a husband, far from family, what do you actually have?" I had an apartment in Chicago. I had a salary. I had colleagues who had become friends. I had the feeling, for the first time in my adult life, that the decisions about my day were mine. But I knew that saying that out loud in that room would be interpreted as arrogance. So I stayed quiet. "The Desai family is willing to be generous," she continued. "And your father needs help. Sometimes love means letting go of things, my dear." I looked at her and thought. You have never let go of anything in your life. But I didn't say that either. What I said was, "Thank you for the sweets, Auntie." And I went to my room. It was that same week that I called my manager in Chicago. The conversation started well. He told me they missed me, that the project I had been working on was being handled by another analyst temporarily, that when I returned we could talk about my position. But at some point, in the middle of this reassuring conversation, he mentioned something almost in passing. "Oh, and leadership is reviewing the team structure next quarter." Nothing definitive, but it's good to be around when those conversations happen. I hung up with that sentence reverberating. It's good to be around. I was not around. I was 14,000 kilometers away, in a childhood bedroom that smelled of mothballs and decisions that weren't mine, while my life was moving forward without me. I opened my laptop and looked at the emails I had let pile up, reports I had started and not finished, projects where my name was listed but my contribution had stopped. There was a message from a colleague, Priya, American, coincidentally with the same name as my aunt, which struck me as a cruel irony, saying she had temporarily taken over my desk and that if I needed anything she was available. My desk. Temporarily. I closed the laptop. The turning point came on a Friday evening. My father called me to sit with him after dinner, without my mother, without uncles, without the usual audience. Just the two of us in the living room, with the ceiling fan turning slowly overhead and the television off. He began talking about the past. About what it had been like to grow up poor. About the weight of being the eldest son in a family that depended on him, about the choices he had made trying to ensure that my younger sister and I would have more than he ever had. He spoke with the honesty I had rarely heard from him, without the armor of paternal authority, without the veneer of someone who needs to appear to know what he is doing. And I listened. I listened to everything. Because despite it all, despite the anger, despite the betrayal, despite the arrangement made over my head, he was still my father. And I still loved him with that complicated intensity that one never manages to fully abandon, no matter how hard one tries. But when he finished, when the silence returned and he looked at me with those tired eyes waiting for something, I said carefully, with all the gentleness I could still gather, "I love you, Papaji. And I want to help you resolve this. But not this way. Not by marrying someone to pay off debts. Not by giving up my life as if it were worth nothing." "Then how?" he asked, and there was a genuine vulnerability in the question that split me in two. "Let's sit down with an accountant. Let's look at the real numbers. I'll see what I can do within my actual means. But I need you to treat me as a partner in this, not as a solution." He looked at me for a long moment. Then, very slowly, he nodded. It was not a victory. I knew that. It was the beginning of a long and painful negotiation, and there was still so much left to resolve: the uncles, the Desi family, the expectations of the community, my own visa that had expired 3 weeks after my arrival while I still thought I would only be staying a month. But it was something. And sometimes, when everything is falling apart, something is enough to get through one more night. That night, before going to sleep, I opened my banking app. I looked at the balance in my American account, the money left over after months of sending funds home, the reserve I had built carefully for emergencies. And I thought, this is exactly an emergency. Only the emergency was not what I had imagined when I built that reserve. The emergency was me. September in Pune has a specific light. It is not the golden light of winter, nor the hard white of summer. It is a diffuse light, slightly humid, that hangs in the air after the monsoon rains as if the sky has not yet decided what it wants to be. I grew up in that light and had never paid attention to it. It took 5 years in a country in the other hemisphere to come back and notice it existed. It had been 6 weeks since I arrived in Pune. 6 weeks that had felt like 6 months. In that time, I had done things I never imagined I would do when I bought that Chicago ticket with the innocence of someone who thinks they are staying a month. I had sat down with my father and a neighborhood accountant, a quiet, precise man named Mr. Kulkarni, and looked at the real numbers for the first time. I had discovered that the debt, though serious, was not the bottomless abyss that the atmosphere of family crisis had suggested. It was grave. It was real. But it had a solution, a slow, disciplined solution, without dramatic shortcuts. Without me as a shortcut. I had reached out to the Desai family, not personally, but through my uncle Vikram, who at least had the good sense to understand when a battle wasn't worth fighting, and communicated with all possible courtesy that there would be no marriage. There was offense taken. There were comments that reached me through roundabout channels, as comments always travel in Indian families. They said I had become too westernized. That I had forgotten my values. That a woman nearly 30 without a husband was a problem I had created for myself. I heard all of that and remained standing. It was not easy. It would be a lie to say it was. What nobody tells you about resisting family pressure is that the hardest part is not the people who shout. It is the ones who go quiet. My mother didn't say a single word against my decision to refuse the marriage. But she didn't say a word in favor either. She continued doing what she had always done, cooking, cleaning, watering the plants on the balcony, existing in the corners of the house with that gentle, self-effacing presence that I had admired as a child and that now filled me with a complex sadness. She had spent her entire life yielding. And I didn't know whether she was at peace with that, or whether she had simply forgotten what it felt like to want something else. One morning, I was in the kitchen with her, peeling vegetables in silence, and she said without looking at me, "You were always different, Anika. Since you were small. Is different bad?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment. "Different is difficult," she said finally. "For you and for everyone around you. It wasn't a criticism. I understood that. It was an observation, perhaps the most honest one she had offered me in years. And I spent days turning that sentence over, examining it, trying to find in it something that would tell me what to do next. Different is difficult. Yes. It was. It was in the 7th week that the email arrived. I was sitting in my childhood bedroom with the laptop on my lap, trying to work remotely on some freelance projects I had managed to find to keep some income flowing while I was in limbo, neither in Chicago nor truly settled in Pune. The email came from HR at the Chicago company, with the formal, antiseptic subject line that HR uses when it wants to say something nobody wants to hear. In summary, the team restructuring had happened. My position had been eliminated. There was a severance package. There was a deadline to respond. There was the standard paragraph about how my contributions had been valued. I read the email 3 times. Then I closed the laptop, placed it on the floor, and stared at the wall for a stretch of time I couldn't measure. It was what I had feared since that conversation with my manager weeks earlier. Life in Chicago had not waited. It had moved forward, reorganized, filled my empty spaces with other people and other plans, the way life does when you are not present to hold the place that was yours. My visa had expired. My job was gone. My apartment, I had asked a friend to watch my things when I left, thinking I'd be back within weeks, had a lease ending the following month. In practical terms, I no longer had a life in Chicago to return to. That realization didn't arrive all at once. It came in layers, over those hours sitting in my room, like when you cut your finger and in the first second it doesn't hurt, and then it does. My father knocked on my door that night. I had forgotten to eat dinner, my mother had sent word twice that the food was on the table, and I had replied that I wasn't hungry. Which in our household is almost a declaration of emotional emergency. He came in without waiting for my response, which was, in fact, a sign of affection from him, that ceremony-free intimacy that parents and children share and that we sometimes only notice when it is about to change. He sat in the chair. Looked at me. The job, he said. It wasn't a question. How do you know? Your mother saw your face at the computer in the morning and again in the afternoon. She knows when something is wrong. I almost smiled despite everything. I told him. Not the technical details, just the essentials. The job was gone. The visa had expired. The life I had built on the other side of the world had, while I was here trying to fix his problems, quietly come undone. My father listened to everything without interrupting me. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment. And then he said something I didn't expect, something that, in the weeks and months that followed, I would return to repeatedly in my memory like someone who returns to a scene they can't let go of. I was wrong, Anika. Simple as that. No elaboration, no justification, no, but that usually follows when adults admit mistakes to their children. I was wrong. And I don't know how to fix what happened. But I don't want you to lose anything more because of me. I looked at him, at this man who had been, in my childhood, the most solid figure I knew, and who was sitting across from me now looking finally human in a way I had never been given permission to see, and I felt that specific pain of loving someone who has deeply disappointed you and continuing to love them anyway. I've already lost. I said, without anger. With exhaustion. The question now is what I do from here. In the days that followed, I made decisions. Not the dramatic decisions that stories like this sometimes call for. I didn't run away, didn't cut ties with the family, didn't board a flight to nowhere with a backpack and a broken heart. Real life rarely offers such clean gestures. I decided to stay in Pune for a few more months. Not because I was trapped, but because there were unfinished things I needed to conclude with integrity, and because running away was not the same as choosing. I helped my father put together a real debt repayment plan, something Mr. Kulkarni would oversee monthly, with installments within what the family could pay without depending exclusively on me. My contribution would be smaller than it had been, and this time, I would know exactly where every rupee was going. I started working remotely as a freelance analyst, small projects at first, but enough to maintain my financial independence while I rebuilt. There was a growing market for that kind of work, and my American-trained skills had value at Indian companies that wanted international standards. I spoke with my mother, truly, for the first time in years. Not about problems or solutions, but about her. About what she had wanted to be when she was young, about the dreams she had folded up and tucked away in some drawer of memory to fit within the space life had reserved for her. She spoke with the shyness of someone unaccustomed to being the subject, but she spoke. And I listened. It was the closest we had ever been, perhaps. One afternoon in October, the September light had evolved into something more golden. More definitive. I went up to the terrace of our house and stood looking at the neighborhood below. The same streets. The same rooftops. The same water tower in the corner that had been there since before I was born. And at the same time, everything different, or me different, which amounts to the same thing. I thought about Chicago. I thought about the small apartment that had been mine for 5 years, about the snow-covered sidewalks. About the chai I used to make alone trying to replicate something that had no replication. I thought about the version of me that had existed there, freer, perhaps. Lonelier, certainly. More whole in some ways, more incomplete in others. There was no version of my life that came without a cost. That was the hardest thing to accept, that there was no right choice waiting for me, clear and shadowless, if only I were brave enough to find it. There were choices. All of them with weight. All of them leading me toward a different version of myself, no version complete, no version without loss. I had come back out of love. That was true. I had been used as a solution. That was also true. Both things coexisted without canceling each other out, and learning to live with that ambiguity was, perhaps, the most real growth those months gave me. Today, as I write this, I am sitting on that same terrace. My father is better, his heart was a real condition, the doctor confirmed after more detailed tests, but treatable, monitored, under control. My mother has learned to call me just to talk, not only when something is wrong. My younger sister, Preethi, who stayed on the sidelines of all of this while studying in Bangalore, came back for a visit last month and kept looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, admiration and pity in equal parts, perhaps. Life in Chicago now exists as a memory I visit with warmth and without bitterness. It may be that I return someday, to the United States or somewhere else. It may be that my next chapter is written in another country, in another language, in another version of me. Or it may be written here. I don't know. And I have learned, at high cost, with real pain, that not knowing is not the same as being lost. What I know is this: I chose to come back. And that choice had a price I had not calculated. But I made it with love, and love, even when it costs us everything, is the only currency that in the end does not feel like a waste. Even when it hurts. Especially when it hurts. My name is Anika Sharma. I am 29 years old. And I am still learning what it means to be free.